The night Liora Vance ran, she chose death over obedience. That's what they said in town the morning after, when they found her father's house empty, the front door swinging in the wind and muddy tracks leading straight toward the one place no soul dared follow, into the Blackwood, toward his land, toward Rhett Calder's house, where good people didn't go and bad people didn't return from. But Liora wasn't thinking about survival when she ran. She was thinking about the alternative, a lifetime shackled to a man twice her age who smelled like whiskey and spoke to her like property. If you want to know how a girl with nothing defeated a town with everything, stay until the end. Drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The storm hit Grafton's Bend like the fist of something furious. It came without warning, the way the worst things always do. One moment the sky was bruised purple along the horizon, the next it split open and dumped the kind of rain that turned roads into rivers and fields into lakes. Thunder rolled across the valley in long, booming waves that shook the window panes in their frames. Lightning cracked the darkness into jagged white pieces, and in those brief flashes of light, you could see the cottonwoods bending nearly double under the wind. Inside the Vance house, Liora stood at the window of her second-floor bedroom, watching the storm devour the world. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes, ever since her father had slammed the door downstairs and ridden off into town with that look on his face. The look that said he'd made a deal and expected everyone to honor it. The look that said her life had just been sold to the highest bidder. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold, though the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that coiling in her stomach like a snake. They were shaking because she'd made a decision, and her body knew what was coming even if her mind hadn't fully caught up yet. She was leaving. Tonight. In the middle of a storm that could kill her just as easily as staying here would. Behind her, the bedroom door opened. Liora didn't turn around. She knew the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the boots her father only wore when he wanted to remind everyone who owned what. "You should be packing your things," Thomas Vance said. His voice was flat, emotionless, the way it always was when he'd decided something and didn't want to hear arguments. "Garrison's coming by tomorrow morning to sign the papers. You'll move to his place by week's end." Leora's reflection stared back at her from the rain-streaked glass. 22 years old, dark hair pulled back tight enough to make her scalp ache. Eyes that had learned not to cry a long time ago. "I'm not marrying him," she said quietly. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "You think you got a choice in this?" "I know I do." "You know nothing." The boots came closer. "You think because your mama let you read books and have opinions that you're something special? You're not. You're a daughter in a hard country with no money and no prospects. Garrison's offering good terms, better than you deserve. A house, land, security. He's 53 years old. So? He's healthy, strong, got more property than any 3 families combined. He buries wives." Liora turned to face him now. 2 of them. Both younger than I am now, both dead within 5 years. Thomas Vance's jaw tightened. He was a big man, made bigger by years of ranch work that had turned his shoulders to stone and his hands to leather. His face was weathered like old wood, all hard lines and deep cracks. He'd been handsome once, her mother had said, before the drought, before the cattle plague, before everything good had withered and died and left only this, a man who saw daughters as assets and love as weakness. "Women die in childbirth," he said. "That's the way of things. Doesn't make him a killer." "Then you marry him." The slap came fast, but not unexpected. Liora had felt it building in the air between them like static before lightning. Her head snapped to the side, cheek burning, but she didn't make a sound. Didn't give him the satisfaction. "You'll do as you're told," Thomas said, and there was something cold in his voice now, something final. "I've already taken his money. The deal's done. You walk down those stairs tomorrow morning in a clean dress with a civil tongue, or I'll drag you down myself. Understand?" Liora touched her cheek, felt the heat there, felt the old familiar weight of helplessness pressing down on her shoulders. Then she felt something else. Rage. Pure, white-hot, clarifying rage. "I understand," she said softly. Thomas studied her for a moment, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But Liora had learned to hide her thoughts behind a still face years ago. He saw what he wanted to see: compliance, resignation, defeat. "Good." He turned toward the door. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. The door closed. The lock clicked from the outside. Liora waited until his footsteps faded down the hall. Waited until she heard the creak of his bedroom door, the groan of his bed taking his weight. Waited until the house settled into the kind of silence that meant everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be. Then she moved. Her bag was already packed, had been for 3 days, ever since she'd overheard her father negotiating with Garrison in the study. Not much in it. A change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, a small leather journal filled with her own handwriting. $43 she'd saved from selling eggs and preserves at the town market over the last 2 years. Everything she owned that mattered could fit in a canvas rucksack small enough to carry on one shoulder. She dressed quickly in the dark. Wool trousers that had belonged to a cousin, a heavy shirt, her riding boots, a coat that was too big but warm. She tied her hair back with a strip of leather and checked the window. The storm was getting worse. Rain hammered against the glass in sheets. Wind howled around the eaves like something alive and hunting. Lightning turned the world into a series of frozen snapshots, trees bending, fences shaking, the barn roof lifting at the corners. Any sane person would wait. Liora opened the window. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Rain sprayed into the room, soaking the floor, the curtains, her face. She grabbed her bag, swung one leg over the sill, and found the trellis her mother had planted 15 years ago with dreams of roses that never grew. The wood was slick, old. It groaned under her weight, but held. Liora didn't think. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking led to doubt, and doubt led to staying, and staying led to becoming one of Garrison's dead wives with a headstone that said she'd been beloved and dutiful and gone too soon. She climbed down. The ground was mud. Her boots sank into it immediately, sucking at her heels. She pulled free and ran, across the yard, past the barn where the horses screamed at the storm, through the gate that swung open on rusted hinges. Behind her, the house sat dark and still. No lights came on. No one shouted. Her father slept the sleep of men who believed their will was law. Liora hit the main road and turned north. There were 3 roads out of Grafton's Bend. South led to the county seat, 30 miles of flat farming country where everyone knew everyone and secrets traveled faster than horses. East led to the mining camps in the hills, rough places full of rougher men. West led back toward her father's land and the properties of families who would send her right back home for a finder's fee. North led to the Blackwood, and beyond that, to nothing anyone talked about. The stories about the Blackwood were old, the kind that got told in pieces over years until no one remembered where they started. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of Shoshone warriors who died fighting the settlers. Others said there were wolves in there, big as ponies, with eyes that glowed red in the dark. Children dared each other to walk to the tree line and touch the first trunk, and the ones who did came back pale and quiet, saying they'd heard things moving in the shadows that didn't move like animals. But the stories everyone knew, the ones that got repeated in whispers over drinks at the saloon, were about the man who lived past the Blackwood. Rhett Calder. No one knew where he'd come from. He'd appeared 5 years ago with enough money to buy 1,000 acres of wild land that no one else wanted. Too far from town, too close to the mountains, too hard to work. He'd built a house out there, raised fences, kept to himself. And when people tried to be neighborly, tried to invite him to church or town meetings or harvest dances, he'd declined with the kind of polite firmness that made it clear he didn't want company. That should have been enough. Grafton's Bend had its share of hermits and loners, but Rhett Calder was different. He was too calm, too still. When he came into town for supplies, he moved like a man who'd done violence and knew exactly how much damage he was capable of. He didn't start fights, but men stepped out of his way anyway. He didn't threaten anyone, but there was something in his eyes, some cold, watchful intelligence, that made people nervous. And then there was the incident with the Morrison boys. 3 brothers, mean as snakes, who'd been running protection rackets on the smaller ranchers for years. Everyone knew about it. No one did anything. The sheriff was either bought or scared, and the few men who'd tried to stand up to the Morrisons had ended up with burned barns or poisoned wells or worse. The Morrisons made the mistake of trying to intimidate Rhett Calder. Details were fuzzy. No one had been there to see it, but the result was clear. All 3 brothers ended up at Doc Peterson's office with broken bones and concussions. They never said what happened, never pressed charges, and they never went near Calder's land again. After that, people gave him a wide berth, and they talked. He's killed men before. You can see it in the way he moves. He's running from something. No one chooses to live that far out unless they're hiding. Stay away from him. Stay away from his land. Nothing good lives in those woods. Liora had heard the stories. Everyone had. She headed straight toward them. The rain was so heavy she could barely see 10 feet ahead. The road had turned into a river of mud that sucked at her boots with every step. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, and in the brief moments of illumination, Liora could see the landscape transforming around her. Familiar fields becoming alien lakes, fence posts standing like sentinels in water up to their middles, trees thrashing in the wind like they were trying to uproot themselves and flee. She'd been walking for an hour when she realized she'd lost the road. Panic touched her throat. She spun in a slow circle, trying to orient herself, but everything looked the same in the dark and the rain. No lights, no landmarks, just endless darkness broken by flashes of lightning that showed her nothing useful. She picked a direction and kept walking. Her legs ached. Her clothes were soaked through. Water ran down her back, pooled in her boots, dripped from her hair into her eyes. She was shaking now, real shaking, the kind that came from cold sinking into your bones and refusing to leave. This was stupid, she thought. This was stupid, and you're going to die out here, and your father will find you in the morning, face down in the mud, and he'll bury you next to Mama and tell everyone you were always too headstrong for your own good. But then she thought about Garrison's house, the way it smelled like old meat and cigars, the way his hand had felt on her arm the one time he'd visited, too tight, too possessive, like he was testing merchandise. She kept walking. The ground started to rise. Trees appeared out of the darkness, tall black shapes that blocked the rain for brief seconds before she stumbled past them. She was climbing now, her boots sliding on wet roots and slick stones. The blackwood. She'd reached the blackwood without meaning to. Liora stopped, breathing hard, and looked back the way she'd come. Nothing but darkness and rain. She could turn around, try to find the road. Head for one of the ranches on the eastern edge of town and throw herself on their mercy. Or she could keep going, into the woods where no one goes, toward the house where the dangerous man lives. She thought about the Morrison brothers, about broken bones and silence. She thought about Garrison, about dead wives and a life of slow suffocation. She stepped into the trees. Yet, the blackwood swallowed sound. It was the first thing she noticed, how the roar of the storm faded to a dull murmur once she passed the tree line. The canopy was thick enough to block most of the rain, turning the downpour into a steady drip that pattered on the leaves overhead. The air smelled like wet earth and pine resin, and something else, something old and green. Liora walked for what felt like hours, her hands out in front of her, feeling her way past trunks that loomed out of the darkness like pillars in a cathedral. Her breath came in short gasps, her heart hammered against her ribs. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you? Then she saw light, faint, warm, flickering yellow through the trees ahead. A house. It had to be. There was nothing else out here. No ranches, no cabins, no hunters' camps. Just Calder's place, the house everyone in town knew about, but no one visited. Liora stood frozen for a long moment, staring at that distant light. This was the last chance. The last moment she could turn back, stumble her way to town, show up at her father's door soaked and sorry and willing to do what she was told. She thought about her mother, about the way she'd looked in the last year of her life, hollowed out, exhausted, old before her time, about the way she'd gripped Leora's hand on her deathbed and whispered, "Don't let him make you small. Don't let anyone make you small." Liora walked toward the light. The house materialized out of the darkness like something from a dream. It was bigger than she'd expected, a solid 2-story structure built from dark wood that blended into the trees around it. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. Windows glowed with lamplight. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and on that porch, protected from the rain, sat a pair of rocking chairs that looked like they'd been carved from single pieces of wood. It looked normal, peaceful even. Liora climbed the steps to the porch, her boots leaving muddy prints on the clean boards. She stood in front of the door, dripping, shaking, trying to figure out what to say. "I'm running from my father. I need help. Please don't kill me." She raised her fist and knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. The house was silent, except for the crackle of a fire somewhere inside. Liora knocked again, harder this time, and heard movement. Footsteps crossing a floor, steady and unhurried. The door opened. Rhett Calder stood in the doorway, and Leora's first thought was that the stories had gotten it wrong. They'd made him sound like a monster, 7 feet tall, scarred, cruel. But the man in front of her was just a man. Tall, yes, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", with broad shoulders and the kind of build that came from hard work rather than bulk. Dark hair cut short, a face that was more weathered than handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, eyes that were a cold, clear gray. He was wearing work pants and a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hands were scarred across the knuckles. He looked at her without expression, didn't speak, just stood there taking in her soaked clothes, her muddy boots. The desperate look she knew was written all over her face. Leora's voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. I need help. Rhett Calder's gaze moved past her, scanning the darkness beyond the porch, looking for something or someone. You alone? His voice was low, rough from disuse. Yes. Anyone following you? I don't think so. I got lost in the storm. I don't know where I am. His eyes came back to her face. They were assessing, calculating, reading her the way you'd read a book, looking for lies. You're on my land, he said, 5 miles past the Blackwood. Town's 8 miles southeast. 8 miles. She'd walked that far in the storm without knowing it. I can't go back, Liora heard herself say. I can't. I won't. Who are you running from? The question was direct, blunt, no sympathy in it, just a need for information. My father. The words came out before she could stop them. He sold me to a man named Garrison. I'm supposed to marry him tomorrow, and I'd rather die. Something flickered in Rhett Calder's expression. Not quite sympathy, more like recognition. Like he'd heard those words before, or felt them himself. Garrison. He said the name like it tasted bad. The one who owns half the valley? Yes. You're Thomas Vance's daughter. It wasn't a question. Liora nodded anyway. Rhett was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, weighing options, calculating risks. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. Get inside before you freeze to death. The interior of the house was nothing like Liora had expected. She'd pictured something dark and sparse, a bachelor's dwelling with bare walls and minimal furniture. But this place was comfortable. A fire burned in a large stone fireplace, casting warm light across a main room that held a worn leather sofa, a heavy wooden table, bookshelves lined with actual books. The walls were paneled in dark wood. Rugs covered the floor. Everything was clean, organized, purposeful. It looked like a home. Rhett closed the door behind her and moved to the fireplace without a word. He picked up a poker and stirred the logs, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Liora stood in the entryway, dripping on the floorboards, suddenly aware of how she must look, half drowned, desperate, tracking mud into this man's clean house. I'm sorry, she started. I didn't mean to. Bathroom's down the hall, first door on the left. Rhett didn't look at her. There's towels in the cabinet. Get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia. There's a robe on the back of the door. Use that for now. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction delivered with the expectation of compliance. Liora found herself moving before she'd consciously decided to, walking down the hallway he'd indicated, finding the bathroom. It was as clean and well-kept as the rest of the house. White porcelain, copper fixtures, a clawfoot tub that looked like it had been installed by someone who knew what they were doing. The robe hanging on the door was heavy flannel, dark blue, worn soft with age. Liora peeled off her soaked clothes with shaking hands. Her skin was pale, mottled with cold. Her fingers barely worked. She dried off with a towel that smelled like cedar and wrapped herself in the robe. It was enormous on her. Rhett Calder was a big man, but it was warm and dry, and it felt like the first kind thing that had touched her in months. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. Her face was pale, eyes too wide, hair plastered to her skull. She looked young, scared, lost. She looked like exactly what she was, a girl who'd run into the night with no plan and no idea what came next. Liora took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and went back to the main room. Rhett was at the stove in what she could now see was an open kitchen area. He was making something. She could hear water boiling, smell coffee, and something else. He glanced at her when she entered, his gaze taking in the oversized robe, then returned to what he was doing. "Sit by the fire," he said. "Warm up." Liora sat on the edge of the sofa, as close to the flames as she could get without burning. Heat sank into her skin, and she realized she was still shaking, less from cold now, more from shock and exhaustion and the slow realization of what she'd just done. She'd left. Actually left. Burned every bridge behind her and run into the storm, and somehow ended up in the house of the most feared man in the county. And he was making her coffee. Rhett came over with 2 mugs in his hands. He held one out to her, black coffee, steam rising from the surface. She took it, wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic. "Thank you," she said quietly. He sat in the chair across from her, his own mug balanced on one knee. For a moment they just sat there in silence. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the rain still hammering on the roof. "Your father will come looking for you," Rhett said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "When?" "Tomorrow. Maybe sooner if he checks my room tonight." "And he'll come here?" Liora looked up at him. "Maybe. If someone saw me heading north, if—" She paused. "Everyone knows about you, about this place. Most people are too scared to come out here. But you came anyway. I didn't know where else to go." Rhett studied her over the rim of his mug. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, some kind of evaluation happening behind that cold gray gaze. "You can't stay here," he said. The words hit her like a slap. Of course he wouldn't let her stay. Why would he? She was a stranger, a liability, someone else's problem. "I understand," Liora managed. "I'll leave in the morning. I didn't say you had to leave in the morning." Rhett's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "I said you can't stay here. Not permanently. Your father has legal claim on you until you're married or 25. If he finds you here, he can drag you back. And if I try to stop him, it becomes a legal issue. Maybe a violent one. So what am I supposed to do?" "That depends on what you want." Liora blinked. "What I want?" "You ran," Rhett said. "That took courage. But running only works if you know what you're running toward. Otherwise, you're just lost in a different place." He set his mug down on the side table. "So what do you want, Liora Vance? Really want?" No one had ever asked her that. Not once in 22 years. Her father told her what to do. The town told her what was proper. Even her mother, as kind as she'd been, had taught her how to endure rather than how to choose. "I want—" Liora's throat felt tight. "I want to be free, to make my own choices, to not be property." "That's what you don't want," Rhett said. "What do you want?" Liora stared at him. He was watching her with that same intense, evaluating gaze, like he could see past her words to something deeper. "I want a life that's mine," she said finally. "A place where I don't have to be afraid all the time, where I can breathe." Rhett nodded slowly, like she'd said something that made sense to him. "All right," he said. "Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out your options. There's towns further north, places your father doesn't have reach. There's work for women willing to do it. Teaching, bookkeeping, housekeeping for families that need help. I can get you far enough away that Thomas Vance becomes someone else's problem." It was practical, sensible, the smart choice, and it felt like another kind of running. "What if I don't want to keep running?" Liora asked quietly. Rhett raised an eyebrow. "Then you'll have to stand and fight, and you're not ready for that yet." "How do you know?" "Because you're sitting in my house in a borrowed robe asking a stranger for answers instead of making your own decisions." His voice wasn't cruel, just honest. Fighting means knowing what you're willing to lose, knowing what you're willing to do to win. You're not there yet. He stood, picked up his mug, and walked toward the kitchen. "Get some sleep," he said over his shoulder. "There's a guest room upstairs, second door on the right. We'll talk more in the morning." Liora sat by the fire, staring at the flames, her mind spinning. He was right. She wasn't ready. She'd spent her whole life being told what to do, how to think, who to be. One night of running didn't change that, didn't make her brave or strong or capable. But it was a start. She stood, drained the last of her coffee, and headed upstairs. The guest room was simple but clean, a bed with a thick quilt, a nightstand with a lamp, a window that looked out into the darkness of the woods. Leora's wet clothes were already there, spread out on a chair to dry. Rhett must have brought them up while she was sitting by the fire. She climbed into the bed, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and closed her eyes. Sleep should have been impossible. Her mind should have been racing with fear and uncertainty and plans for tomorrow. But her body had other ideas. The warmth, the safety, the sheer exhaustion of the day. It all caught up with her at once. She was asleep in minutes, and she dreamed of open roads and horizons she'd never seen and a life that belonged to no one but herself. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm's fury spent somewhere over the eastern mountains. Liora woke to pale sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong, the walls unfamiliar, the silence too complete. Then memory flooded back. The storm, the run, the house in the Blackwood. Rhett called her. She sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room. Her clothes were still draped over the chair, mostly dry now. The house was quiet except for faint sounds from below, footsteps, the clink of dishes, the low murmur of what might have been a voice. Liora dressed quickly, her fingers stiff and clumsy. The bruise on her cheek had deepened overnight to a purple-yellow bloom that stood out against her pale skin. She touched it gingerly, wincing, then pulled her hair forward to hide it. Old habit. Her mother had taught her that, how to arrange herself so the damage didn't show. She made her way downstairs, following the smell of food. Rhett was in the kitchen, his back to her, working at the stove. He'd changed clothes, clean work shirt, dark pants, boots that looked like they'd seen 1,000 miles. His movements were efficient, economical, the kind that came from years of cooking for one. "Coffee's on the table," he said without turning around. "Eggs will be ready in a minute." Liora hesitated in the doorway. In the morning light, the house looked even more solid than it had the night before. Sunlight poured through wide windows, illuminating details she'd missed in the dark. The careful joinery of the furniture, the books organized by subject on the shelves, a violin case resting in the corner that seemed wildly out of place in a frontiersman's home. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table. Through the window, she could see the woods stretching in all directions, thick and green and impenetrable. No sign of the road. No sign of anything human except this house and the man who lived in it. Rhett brought over 2 plates loaded with eggs, bacon, and thick slices of bread toasted dark. He set one in front of her and took the seat across, his own coffee already steaming at his elbow. "Eat," he said. "We need to talk, and you need food in you first." Liora picked up her fork. The eggs were perfect, not too dry, seasoned with something that might have been thyme. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite hit her stomach. She ate quickly, trying not to seem desperate, but Rhett didn't appear to notice or care. He ate in silence, his attention on his plate, giving her space. When she'd cleaned half her plate, he spoke. "Your father came by last night." Leora's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "What?" "About 2 hours after you fell asleep. Rode up with 2 of his ranch hands, all of them soaked to the bone and mad as hell." Rhett took a sip of coffee. "Asked if I'd seen a girl matching your description, said you'd run off in the storm and he was worried sick." "What did you tell him?" "That I hadn't seen anyone. That if a girl had been stupid enough to run into the Blackwood during a storm, she was probably dead by now." He met her eyes. He didn't believe me. Leora's appetite vanished. She set down her fork. "Did he try to search the house?" "He tried. I told him he was welcome to get a warrant and come back with the sheriff. Until then, my property was my property, and he could get the hell off it." "And he left?" "Eventually." Rhett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "After making it clear that he knows you're here and he'll be back, with legal standing next time." The walls felt like they were closing in. Liora stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the trees. "I should go," she said. "You were right. I can't stay here. I'll just bring trouble to your door." Trouble's already at my door. Rhett's voice was calm behind her. Has been since the day I bought this land. Your father coming around doesn't change much. It changes everything. If he gets the sheriff involved, the sheriff's a coward who does what he's told by whoever has the most money. Right now, that's your father and men like Garrison. Rhett stood, carried his plate to the sink. But legal standing only matters if you care about the law. And I've found that the law in places like Grafton's Bend tends to serve the people who write it, not the people who need it. Liora turned to look at him. He was rinsing his plate, his movements methodical, his face unreadable. So what are you saying? I'm saying you have options. None of them are easy, but they're yours to choose. He dried his hands on a towel and faced her. Option 1. I take you north today. Get you on a coach to a city where your father's name means nothing. You start over, new name, new life. It'll be hard, and you'll be alone, but you'll be free. And option 2? You stay, for a while at least. Learn what you need to learn. Learn what? How to stand your ground. Rhett leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. You said last night you wanted a life that was yours, that you wanted to stop running. But wanting it and being able to hold on to it are different things. Right now, you don't know how. The words stung because they were true. Liora had spent 22 years learning how to bend, how to accommodate, how to make herself smaller so other people could feel bigger. She didn't know how to fight, didn't know how to hold her ground when someone pushed. And you'd teach me. I'd give you the space to learn. There's work that needs doing around here. Cooking, cleaning, helping with the land. You do that, you earn your keep. And in the meantime, you figure out who you are when no one's telling you. It sounded too simple, too good to be true. Why would you do this? Liora asked. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Rhett was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant, fixed on something she couldn't see. I know what it's like, he said finally. To be trapped in a life someone else built for you. To run because it's the only option that doesn't kill you. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she recognized. Old pain, carefully buried, but never quite gone. I got out. Took me years and cost me more than I like to think about. But I got out. If I can help someone else do the same, I will. The kitchen was silent except for the tick of a clock on the wall and the distant call of a bird outside. What happens when my father comes back? Liora asked. We deal with it. How? Depends on how he comes. If he comes alone, we talk. If he comes with men and guns, we make it clear that's not a fight he'll win. Rhett's voice was steady, factual, but it won't come to that. Men like your father are bullies. They rely on intimidation and the assumption that no one will stand against them. You take that away, they crumble faster than you'd think. Liora wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that her father, who'd ruled her entire life with an iron fist, was just another bully who could be faced down. But the bruise on her cheek said otherwise. The locked bedroom door said otherwise. 22 years of compliance said otherwise. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. You already did the hard part, Rhett said. You ran. Everything else is just details. He pushed away from the counter and walked toward the door. I've got work to do in the east pasture. You're welcome to come along, or you can stay here and rest. Either way, make a decision about what you want by tonight. I won't push you one way or the other, but you need to choose. The door closed behind him, and Liora was alone with the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She walked through the house slowly, taking in details she'd missed the night before. The books on the shelves were an eclectic mix. Practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry, alongside philosophy, history, even poetry. The furniture was handmade but beautifully crafted, each joint precise, each surface smooth. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, nothing that spoke to who Rhett Calder had been before he came here. It was a house that had been built to forget the past. Upstairs she found 2 more bedrooms, one clearly Rhett's, sparse and military neat, the other empty except for a few boxes stacked against the wall. The bathroom she'd used last night was immaculate, everything in its place, everything controlled. It reminded her of Rhett himself, contained, purposeful, revealing nothing unnecessary. She went back downstairs and stood at the front window, looking out at the land. From here she could see the pasture Rhett had mentioned, a wide expanse of cleared ground dotted with fence posts. He was out there now. a small figure in the distance, working on something she couldn't make out from this far away. Liora made her decision. She found work clothes in the closet by the back door, oversized for her, but they'd do. She laced up her boots, tied her hair back, and headed outside. The air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the storm. Mud still slicked the ground in places, but the sun was already beginning to dry it out. Liora crossed the yard and made her way toward the pasture, her boots squelching in the wet earth. Rhett was fixing a section of fence that had come down in the storm. He looked up when she approached, his expression neutral. "Changed your mind about resting?" "I want to help," Liora said. "If I'm going to stay, I should work." Rhett studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a pile of posts on the ground. "All right, hand me those one at a time. We need to replace this whole section before the horses get any ideas about freedom." They worked in silence for the better part of an hour. The labor was hard, lifting posts, holding them steady while Rhett drove them into the ground, stringing wire between them. Liora's hands blistered quickly. Her shoulders ached, but she didn't complain, didn't stop, just kept working, finding a rhythm in the repetitive motion. "You've done this before," Rhett observed, glancing at how she held the next post. "My father's ranch. I helped with repairs when the hands were short." "He let you do manual labor?" "He didn't let me do much of anything, but when it was between me helping and the work not getting done, he made exceptions." Liora positioned the post carefully. "I think he resented it, having to rely on me. His loss." Rhett hammered the post home with 3 precise strikes. "You're good at this." The compliment was small, casual, but it landed in Liora's chest like something warm. When was the last time someone had praised her for anything other than being quiet or obedient? They finished the fence as the sun climbed toward noon. Rhett stepped back, surveyed their work, and nodded once in satisfaction. "Good. That'll hold." He pulled off his gloves. "There's a creek about a quarter-mile north. Good place to wash up and cool down before lunch." Liora followed him through the trees, her muscles already stiffening from the unaccustomed work. The creek was exactly where he'd said it would be, a clear, fast-moving stream that cut through the woods like a silver ribbon. Rhett knelt at the edge and splashed water on his face and neck. Liora did the same, gasping at how cold it was. The water was so clear she could see every stone on the bottom, every flash of tiny fish darting between the rocks. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. "It is." Rhett sat back on his heels, looking at the creek like he was seeing it for the first time. "That's why I bought this land. Everyone else saw wilderness and difficulty. I saw peace." "Do you get lonely out here?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Rhett glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I prefer lonely to the alternative." "Which is?" "Being around people who want to use you, or change you, or break you down until you fit their idea of who you should be." He stood, brushed dirt off his pants. "I've had enough of that for one lifetime." They walked back to the house in comfortable silence. Liora found herself wondering about his past. What had happened to him? Who he'd been before this? What had driven him to isolate himself so completely? But she didn't ask. She understood the need for privacy, for keeping certain doors closed. Lunch was simple: bread, cheese, apples from a root cellar that was better stocked than Liora would have expected. They ate on the porch, watching clouds drift across the sky. "I'll stay," Liora said suddenly, "if the offer's still open. I want to stay and learn." Rhett didn't look surprised. "All right. Ground rules, then. You work, you pull your weight. This isn't charity. You earn your place here." "Understood." "You sleep in the guest room, door locks from the inside. Your space is yours. I don't come in without permission." Liora felt tension she hadn't known she was carrying ease slightly. "Thank you. And when your father comes back, and he will, you decide how to handle it. I'll support you, back you up, but the choice is yours. I won't fight your battles for you." "I wouldn't ask you to." "Good." Rhett finished his apple, tossed the core into the woods. "Then we have a deal. You can stay as long as you need." The afternoon passed in a blur of work. Rhett showed her around the property, the barn where he kept 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens, the garden plot that would need planting soon, the workshop where he built furniture in the winter months. Everything was organized, efficient, clearly the work of someone who'd thought carefully about how to make a life in isolation work. As the sun started to sink toward the horizon, Liora found herself in the kitchen, watching Rhett prepare dinner. He moved with the same precision he brought to everything else, measuring, chopping, seasoning with confidence. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked. "Army," he said simply. "You learn fast when it's cook or starve." "You were a soldier?" "For a while." He didn't elaborate, and Liora didn't push. They ate dinner as the last light faded from the sky. Afterward, Rhett built up the fire and settled into his chair with a book. Liora sat on the sofa, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. "You should get some rest," Rhett said, glancing up from his reading. "Tomorrow we'll start early. There's a lot to do before winter." Liora nodded, but didn't move. She was staring at the fire, her mind churning with everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. "Rhett? Yeah? Why aren't you afraid of my father? Everyone else in town is." Rhett closed his book, his thumb marking the page. He was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across his features. "I've seen worse than Thomas Vance," he said finally. "I've faced men who had real power, real danger behind them. Your father's just a rancher who's used to getting his way because no one's bothered to tell him no. That's not the same as being dangerous." "He hit me," Liora said quietly. "Last night before I ran. He's hit me before." Rhett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That makes him a coward, not a threat. Big difference." "You really believe that?" "I know it." He opened his book again. "Get some sleep, Liora. Tomorrow's a new day." She went upstairs, her body aching pleasantly from the work, her mind clearer than it had been in years. As she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, she realized something had shifted. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was ready for it. The next 3 days fell into a pattern that felt almost shockingly normal. Liora woke with the sun, helped Rhett with morning chores, worked alongside him on whatever needed doing. They fixed fences, cleared brush, repaired the barn roof where wind had torn away shingles. In the afternoons, while Rhett worked on larger projects, Liora took over the domestic tasks: cooking, cleaning, organizing supplies. She was good at it, better than good. And Rhett noticed. "You don't have to reorganize my entire kitchen," he said one afternoon, finding her elbow deep in the pantry. "It wasn't organized," Liora countered. "It was chaos masquerading as function. Now it's actually organized." Much Rhett peered at the shelves she'd transformed, everything grouped by type, labeled, easily accessible. "I could never find anything before, could I?" "Not efficiently, no." He almost smiled. "Fair enough. Carry on." The work was hard but satisfying in a way nothing in her old life had been. Every task completed was visible proof of her contribution. Every skill mastered was something she owned. And slowly, almost without noticing, Liora started to feel different, stronger, more solid in her own skin. On the 4th morning, Thomas Vance came back. Liora was in the garden, pulling weeds from between rows of young plants, when she heard the horses. 3 of them, approaching from the south. She straightened slowly, her heart beginning to hammer, and saw them emerge from the tree line. Her father rode in front, his face set in hard lines. Behind him came 2 of his ranch hands, Jake Morrison and Carl Webb, both big men who'd worked for Thomas for years. And beside her father, riding a tall black gelding, was Garrison himself. Leora's stomach turned to ice. She stood frozen for a moment, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to do anything but face what was coming. Then she remembered Rhett's words. "The choice is yours." She set down her trowel, wiped her hands on her pants, and walked toward the house. Rhett was already on the porch, alerted by the sound of hooves. He stood with his arms crossed, perfectly still, watching the riders approach. He didn't look worried, didn't look angry. He just looked ready. Liora climbed the porch steps and stood beside him. Not behind, beside. "Stay quiet," Rhett said softly. "Let me handle this first." The riders pulled up in the yard. Thomas Vance dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who'd been in the saddle too long. His eyes went immediately to Liora, and she saw the fury there, barely contained. "Liora! Inside! Now!" His voice was exactly the same as always, flat, commanding, expecting instant obedience. Liora didn't move. Thomas's jaw clenched. He took a step toward the porch. "I said now, girl, don't make this harder than it needs to be." "She's not going anywhere," Rhett said. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made Thomas stop. "She's here of her own choice. She's a child who doesn't know what's good for her." Thomas's attention shifted to Rhett. "And you're interfering in family business, Calder. That's not something I'll tolerate." "She's 22, not a child. And what she does is her business, not yours." Garrison dismounted then, moving with the careful slowness of a much larger man. He was in his 50s, well-fed, with the kind of face that had once been handsome but had gone to jowls and hard living. His eyes were small, calculating. "Mr. Calder," he said, his voice oily with false friendliness, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Vance and I have an arrangement, a legal arrangement, sanctioned by her father. She's spoken for." "By who?" Rhett asked. "Because I don't see her wearing your ring. I don't see her agreeing to anything. Her father agreed on her behalf. That's how these things work. Maybe in your world, not in mine." Thomas's face was getting redder. "You don't have a say in this, Calder. She's my daughter, my responsibility until she's married, and she will marry Mr. Garrison as agreed." "No." The word came from Liora, quiet but clear. Every head turned toward her. "What did you say?" Thomas's voice was dangerously soft. Liora felt her legs shaking, but she kept her spine straight, kept her voice steady. "I said no. I'm not marrying him. I'm not going back to your house. I'm staying here." "You ungrateful little—" Thomas started toward the porch again, but Rhett shifted slightly, just enough to put himself between them. Thomas stopped, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. "Don't," Rhett said quietly. "You really don't want to do that." The yard went deadly silent. Jake and Carl had their hands on their weapons too, but neither looked eager to draw. They'd heard the stories about Rhett Calder. They knew what had happened to the Morrison boys. "She's my daughter," Thomas said through clenched teeth. "She belongs to me until I say otherwise." "She's a person," Rhett replied. "She doesn't belong to anyone." "The law says different." "Then get the law. Bring the sheriff. Get a warrant. Do it legal and proper." Rhett's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "But until then, she's on my property of her own free will, and you're trespassing." Garrison cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could discuss this more reasonably. Mr. Calder, I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. I'm a wealthy man. I could make it worth your while to—" "I'm not for sale," Rhett said flatly, "and neither is she." "Everyone's for sale," Garrison said with the confidence of a man who'd bought his way through life. "It's just a matter of price." "Then you can't afford me." Thomas was shaking with rage now. "I will be back with the sheriff. And when I come, you'll hand her over or face the consequences." "Looking forward to it," Rhett said. For a long moment, Thomas just stood there, clearly trying to decide whether to escalate. Then Garrison put a hand on his arm. "Let's handle this properly, Thomas, through legal channels." He looked at Liora with eyes that made her skin crawl. "I'm a patient man, Miss Vance. I can wait." The threat in those words was unmistakable. They mounted up and rode away, but the tension in the yard didn't ease even after they disappeared into the trees. Liora felt like she might collapse. Her legs were trembling so hard she had to grab the porch railing for support. "You did good," Rhett said quietly. "I could barely speak." "But you did. You stood your ground. That's what matters." Liora looked at him, this strange man who'd taken her in for no reason other than he understood what it meant to need an escape. "What happens now?" "Now we prepare. Your father will be back, probably with the sheriff, and we need to be ready to stand our ground legally." Rhett turned toward the door. "Come inside. We need to talk strategy." Inside, Rhett poured them both coffee with hands that were perfectly steady. Liora's were still shaking as she wrapped them around the warm mug, trying to absorb some of its heat into her cold fingers. "He'll come back with the sheriff," she said, "and the sheriff will side with him. Everyone in town knows Sheriff Porter does whatever my father tells him to." "Probably." Rhett sat across from her at the table. "But there's legal and then there's right. They're not always the same thing. The law says I'm his responsibility until I marry or turn 25. That's 3 more years. 3 years where he can drag me back anytime he wants." Unless you're married to someone else first. Leora's head snapped up. What? The law you're talking about. It gives your father guardianship until you're married or of age. Marriage transfers that authority to your husband. Rhett's expression was thoughtful, calculating. If you were married, your father would have no legal claim on you at all. I'm not marrying Garrison. I wasn't suggesting you should. He took a sip of coffee. I'm saying there might be another option, a legal solution that doesn't involve you being trapped. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Liora stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting without actually saying. You can't be serious. It would solve the problem. Legally, permanently. Your father couldn't touch you. Garrison would have no claim. You'd be free to live your life however you wanted. As your wife. In name only. Rhett's voice was calm, matter of fact. It would be a legal arrangement, nothing more. You'd keep the guest room, keep your independence. We'd work the land together like we've been doing. The only difference would be the paper that said you were under my protection instead of your father's. But Liora felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. Why would you do that? What would you get out of it? Peace and quiet, hopefully. If you're my wife, your father stops coming around. Garrison stops making claims. And I get help running this place, which I could use. He shrugged. It's practical. It's insane. Maybe. But so is running into a storm with nowhere to go. So is standing up to 3 armed men when you're terrified. You've already done the insane part, Liora. This is just paperwork. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, turning the clearing into a patchwork of light and shadow. Everything looked peaceful, normal, like the world hadn't just tilted sideways. People will talk, she said. They'll say terrible things about both of us. They already do. About me, anyway. I stopped caring what this town thought a long time ago. But a marriage, even a false one, that's permanent. You can't just undo it when it stops being convenient. True. Rhett came to stand beside her at the window. But there are worse things than being tied to someone who respects your choices, who gives you space to figure out who you are, who doesn't expect anything from you except honest work and honest dealing. Liora looked at him, really looked at him. He was watching the trees, his profile sharp against the light, his expression unreadable as always. He meant it. He was actually offering to legally bind himself to a woman he barely knew, just to give her a way out. What if I meet someone? She asked quietly. What if someday I actually want to marry for real? Then we figure it out, get an annulment, a divorce, whatever works. I'm not trying to trap you, Liora. I'm trying to give you options. And if you meet someone, a ghost of something passed across his face, pain maybe, or memory. That's not going to happen. The certainty in his voice told her there was a story there, something deep and old and carefully buried. But this wasn't the time to dig for it. I need to think, she said. Take all the time you need, but your father will be back in a day, maybe 2. So don't think too long. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. Liora went through the motions of her chores, but her mind was miles away, turning over Rhett's proposal from every angle. It was crazy, absolutely crazy. Marrying a man she'd known for less than a week, a man the whole town feared just to escape her father's control. But was it any crazier than the alternative? Marrying Garrison, a man twice her age who'd already buried 2 young wives, living under her father's thumb for 3 more years, waiting for him to sell her off to the next highest bidder? At least with Rhett, she knew what she was getting. He'd been nothing but honest with her, nothing but respectful. He'd given her space, given her choice, given her the first real taste of freedom she'd ever known. By afternoon, she'd made her decision. She found him in the barn repairing a broken stall door. He looked up when she entered, his hand stilling on the wood. I'll do it, Liora said. If the offer's still open, I'll marry you. Rhett studied her face for a long moment. You're sure? No, but I'm sure about what I don't want, and this is the best way to make sure I never have to go back to that life. He nodded slowly. All right then. We'll ride into town tomorrow morning. Get the license, find someone to perform the ceremony. Be done before your father knows what's happening. Just like that? Just like that. He returned to his work on the door. Might want to wear something nice, for appearances. I don't have anything nice. Everything I own is back at my father's house. There's a trunk in the upstairs hall closet. Belonged to, he paused. Belonged to someone who lived here before. Might be something in there that fits. The way he said it made Liora wonder again about his past, about who he'd been before he became the hermit in the Blackwood. But she didn't ask. They were both entitled to their secrets. That evening, after dinner, she went upstairs and found the trunk he'd mentioned. It was cedar, old but well-maintained, with brass fittings that had been polished until they gleamed. She opened it carefully. Inside were women's clothes, carefully folded and preserved. Simple dresses, sturdy and well-made. A wool coat, some undergarments. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a dress of deep blue cotton with tiny white flowers embroidered along the collar and cuffs. Liora lifted it out carefully. It was beautiful in an understated way, the kind of dress a practical woman would wear to something important. A wedding, maybe. Or a funeral? She held it up to herself in the mirror. It would fit, more or less. The woman who'd owned it had been about her size. Her name was Sarah. Liora jumped. Rhett was standing in the doorway, his expression distant. My sister, he continued quietly. She lived here for a while after our parents died, before she got married and moved east. These are hers? She left them behind, said she wanted a fresh start, didn't need anything from her old life. He looked at the dress in Leora's hands. She'd want someone to get use out of them. She was practical that way. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. It's fine. I told you to look. He turned to leave, then paused. The blue one was always her favorite. She wore it when she got married. He was gone before Liora could respond. She folded the dress carefully and set it aside for tomorrow. Then she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what the next day would bring. She was going to get married, to a man who was essentially a stranger. To escape one trap, she was willingly walking into another arrangement that could easily become its own kind of cage. But somehow, lying there in the quiet house, listening to the sounds of Rhett moving around downstairs, she didn't feel trapped. She felt something else entirely. She felt like she was finally taking control of her own story. They left at dawn, riding Rhett's 2 horses through the Blackwood and onto the main road that led to town. Liora wore the blue dress under her coat, her hair braided and pinned up in a style her mother had taught her years ago. Rhett wore dark pants and a clean white shirt, a vest, his boots polished. They looked like any couple heading to town for business. Except they weren't a couple. Not really. They were 2 people making a calculated choice to outmaneuver the people trying to control them. The ride took almost 2 hours. As they got closer to Grafton's Bend, Liora felt her anxiety rising. People would see them. Word would spread. By nightfall, the whole town would know that Thomas Vance's runaway daughter had married Rhett Calder. The scandal would be enormous. Having second thoughts? Rhett asked, reading her expression. Third and fourth thoughts, too. We can still turn back, your choice. But they both knew turning back wasn't really an option. Not anymore. Her father would be coming with the sheriff soon. This was the only move that made sense. No, Liora said. Let's do this. They rode into town just as the shops were opening. A few early risers stared as they passed, their faces registering shock at seeing Liora alive and well after everyone had assumed she'd died in the storm. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to shrink under their gazes. The courthouse was a solid brick building at the center of town. They tied up their horses and climbed the steps. Inside, a clerk sat at a desk, looking bored until he saw who'd walked in. Mr. Calder, he said nervously. Miss Vance? We're here for a marriage license, Rhett said calmly. The clerk's eyes went wide. Does her father know about this? That's none of your concern. We're both of legal age and sound mind. Issue the license. I need to check with... No, you don't. Rhett's voice hardened just slightly. You need to do your job. The law doesn't require parental consent for a woman over 21. Issue the license or I'll file a complaint with the county that you're denying us our legal rights. The clerk swallowed hard, then pulled out the necessary forms with shaking hands. They filled out the paperwork in silence, names, ages, addresses. Rhett paid the fee. The clerk stamped the license and handed it over like it might bite him. You'll need someone to perform the ceremony, he said. Judge Harrison usually... We'll find our own, Rhett said. They walked out into the morning sunlight. Liora felt surreal, like she was watching herself from a distance. She was actually doing this, actually going through with it. "There's a minister 2 streets over," Rhett said. "He doesn't ask questions. We can be done in 10 minutes." They walked through town, and Liora felt eyes on them from every window, every doorway. People were staring, whispering. A woman she vaguely recognized from the market actually gasped and crossed herself. The minister's house was small but tidy, with a garden out front that showed careful tending. Rhett knocked on the door. It opened to reveal an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair. "Mr. Calder," he said, surprised. "This is unexpected." "Reverend Pike, we need a favor, a wedding, today. Now, if possible." The Reverend's eyebrows rose. He looked at Liora, really looked at her, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. Not judgment, just understanding. "Come in," he said quietly. The ceremony was brief, perfunctory. They stood in the Reverend's small parlor with sunlight streaming through lace curtains. The Reverend spoke the traditional words, asking if they took each other, if they promised to honor and respect. Liora heard herself saying, "I do," in a voice that didn't sound like her own. Heard Rhett say the same, his voice steady and sure. "Do you have rings?" the Reverend asked. They didn't. Liora had forgotten about rings entirely. But Rhett reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 simple gold bands that looked old, well-worn. "These were my parents', he said quietly, handing one to Liora. "They'll do." The rings fit, not perfectly, but close enough. Liora stared at the gold on her finger, feeling the weight of it, the finality. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Pike said. He looked at Rhett. "You may kiss your bride." Rhett hesitated, then leaned in and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to Liora's forehead. It was gentle, respectful. Not at all like she'd imagined a wedding kiss would be, but then again, this wasn't a real wedding. It was a legal maneuver. The Reverend filled out the certificate, had them both sign it, added his own signature. "Congratulations," he said, handing them the document. "I hope you'll both find the peace you're looking for." They walked back out into the sunlight as husband and wife. The news spread through town like wildfire. By the time they'd walked 3 blocks, a small crowd had gathered. People staring, pointing, talking in urgent whispers. And then Liora saw her father's horse tied up outside the general store. She stopped walking. Rhett followed her gaze and saw what she'd seen. "We can go around," he said quietly. "No." Liora surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "No, if we're doing this, we're not hiding from it." They walked toward the store. The door opened and Thomas Vance stepped out, Sheriff Porter right behind him. Her father saw them and froze, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and then rage. "Liora!" He started toward them. "Where the hell have you been? We've been searching." Then he saw their clasped hands, saw the rings. He stopped dead. "What," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is that?" "We're married," Liora said. Her voice shook slightly but held. "As of 20 minutes ago, legally performed, properly witnessed." Thomas's face went purple. "You can't. She can't. This isn't legal." "I'm afraid it is, Mr. Vance." Reverend Pike had followed them, the marriage certificate in his hands. "Miss Vance is of legal age. No parental consent required. The marriage is valid under territorial law." "She's been coerced. This man kidnapped her, held her against her will." "Actually," the sheriff said slowly, looking at the certificate, "if she's married to him now, that means she went willingly. Can't kidnap your own wife." "This is insane!" Thomas turned to Liora, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Desperation. He was losing control and he knew it. "Liora, listen to me. This man is dangerous. Everyone knows it. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Liora said. "I'm choosing my own life. For the first time ever, I'm making my own choice." "You're making a mistake that will ruin you." "Maybe. But it's my mistake to make." Garrison pushed through the crowd then, his face thunderous. "This is fraud. Legal fraud. I had an agreement with Thomas. I've already paid." "You paid for something that was never for sale," Rhett said calmly. "Leora's not property. Your agreement with her father is void." The hell it is. I want my money back. Take it up with him. Rhett nodded toward Thomas. But you come near my wife again, we're going to have a problem. The possessiveness in those two words, my wife, sent a strange thrill through Liora. It wasn't real, she reminded herself. It was just for show, just part of the act. But it felt powerful anyway. The crowd was growing, more people coming out of shops and houses to see what the commotion was about. Liora saw faces she recognized, women who'd known her mother, men who'd worked with her father, shopkeepers who'd sold her supplies. All of them staring, judging, gossiping. Let them stare, she thought. Let them talk. She was done living for their approval. Thomas was shaking with rage, his hands clenched into fists. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? It changes everything, Liora said quietly. I'm not yours anymore. I'm not Garrison's. I'm not anyone's but my own. You're a fool. This man will use you up and throw you away, just like... Thomas bit off whatever he was about to say, but the implication hung in the air. Rhett's expression went cold. Careful, Vance, very careful. For a moment, Liora thought her father might actually take a swing at Rhett. She could see him calculating, weighing his rage against his self-preservation. Then Sheriff Porter put a hand on his arm. Let it go, Thomas. It's done. The marriage is legal. There's nothing we can do. Thomas shook off the sheriff's hand. He looked at Liora with something that might have been heartbreak if he were capable of such an emotion. You're dead to me, he said. You hear me? You walk away now. You're no daughter of mine. Liora felt those words like a physical blow. Part of her, the part that was still a scared little girl who'd once loved her father before he'd turned mean and hard, wanted to cry, wanted to apologize, wanted to take it all back. But the rest of her, the part that had grown strong in the last week, stood firm. I can live with that, she said. Thomas turned and stalked away, shouldering through the crowd. Garrison followed, still sputtering about fraud and agreements. The sheriff tipped his hat awkwardly at Liora and Rhett, then left as well. The crowd slowly dispersed, people drifting back to their business but still throwing glances over their shoulders. Liora stood in the middle of the street, feeling like she'd just survived a battle. Rhett touched her elbow gently. Come on, let's go home. Home. The word settled into Leora's chest like an anchor. She had a home now, a real one, chosen by her own free will. It might not be conventional. It might not be what anyone expected, but it was hers. They rode back through the Blackwood in silence, the marriage certificate safely tucked in Rhett's saddlebag. When they reached the house, Rhett helped her dismount, his hands steady and sure. You all right? He asked. I don't know yet, Liora admitted. Ask me tomorrow. Fair enough. He started toward the barn to stable the horses, then paused. For what it's worth, you handled that well. Better than well. You were strong. Coming from him, the compliment meant something. Rhett didn't waste words on flattery or empty praise. Thank you, Liora said, for all of this, for giving me a way out. Thank me by not regretting it. She watched him lead the horses away, then went inside the house. Her house now, legally, officially, hers as much as his. She looked down at the ring on her finger, turned it slowly. It caught the light, gleaming gold against her skin. A symbol of bondage to some women. To her, it was the key to freedom. That night they ate dinner at the table like they had every night for the past week. Nothing had really changed. They were still two people sharing space, sharing work, sharing a life built on mutual respect rather than romance. But something had shifted anyway. There was a weight to the silence now, a sense of permanence that hadn't been there before. They weren't just strangers helping each other anymore. They were bound together, legally and irrevocably, at least for now. I'll start clearing out the second bedroom tomorrow, Rhett said as they cleaned up. Make it into a proper space for you. Give you somewhere that's entirely your own. The guest room is fine. It's temporary. You need something permanent. He dried a plate, set it carefully in the cupboard. And we should probably talk about how this works. The practical side of things. Like what? Like the fact that people will expect us to act like a married couple when we're in town. They'll talk if we don't. Create rumors that could make things difficult. Liora hadn't thought about that. So we pretend? When necessary. But here on this land, we're just us, partners. Nothing more unless you want there to be. The last part hung in the air between them. Liora looked at him, this man who'd given her freedom without asking for anything in return. Who'd married her to protect her without expecting anything that usually came with marriage. "I don't know what I want," she said honestly. "Everything's happened so fast. A week ago, I was a different person. Now I'm married to someone I barely know." "Then we take our time, figure it out as we go. There's no rush." He said it so simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like there was no pressure, no expectation, no agenda hidden behind his words. Liora found herself believing him. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. Rhett went to sit by the fire with his book. Liora climbed the stairs to her room, the guest room that was now her room, in the house that was now her house, with the man downstairs who was now her husband. She changed into her nightdress and lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Somewhere downstairs, Rhett was still awake. She could see lamplight under her door. She touched the ring on her finger again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Her father wouldn't give up easily. Garrison would likely cause trouble. The town would gossip and speculate and make assumptions. But for tonight, she was safe, protected, free to make her own choices. And that, she thought, as sleep finally claimed her, was enough. The first week of marriage passed in a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Liora woke each morning to find Rhett already up, coffee brewing, the day's work mentally mapped out before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. They worked side by side like they had before the ceremony, mending fences, tending the garden, managing the livestock. Nothing had changed except a piece of paper and 2 gold rings, and yet everything felt different. There was a weight to their silences now, a consciousness of each other that hadn't existed before. When Rhett's hand accidentally brushed hers, reaching for the same tool, they both pulled back too quickly. When she caught him watching her across the dinner table, he'd look away with something that might have been embarrassment. The ease they'd found in those first days had been replaced by an awkwardness neither seemed to know how to navigate. On the 8th day, Liora was in the kitchen putting up preserves when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. She set down her wooden spoon and moved to the window. 5 riders came out of the tree line. Her father led them, his face set in grim determination. Behind him rode Sheriff Porter, looking distinctly uncomfortable, and 3 men Liora didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with the look of hired guns about them. Her stomach dropped. "Rhett!" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. He appeared from the back room, took one look out the window, and his whole demeanor shifted. The casual, relaxed man she'd been working alongside all morning vanished, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. The man the town feared. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "No matter what happens, you stay inside until I tell you it's safe." "Rhett, there are 5 of them." "I know. Stay inside." He walked out onto the porch, moving with that same controlled grace she'd noticed the first night. Not hurried, not hesitant, just purposeful. Liora watched from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The riders pulled up in the yard. Thomas dismounted first, followed by the sheriff. The 3 strangers stayed on their horses, hands resting casually near their gun belts. "Mr. Calder," Sheriff Porter said, his voice carrying the false authority of a man who knew he was in over his head. "We need to speak with Miss Vance, Mrs. Calder, whatever she's calling herself now. She's my wife. She goes by Calder, and no, you can't speak with her. I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist." The sheriff pulled out a folded paper from his coat. "I have questions about the circumstances of your marriage. There's been allegations of coercion." "Coercion." Rhett's voice was flat. "She married me of her own free will, in front of a minister and with a legal license. You were there when we presented the certificate. What's changed?" Thomas stepped forward. "What's changed is that I've had time to think about it, to talk to people. And something doesn't add up, Calder. My daughter disappears in a storm, shows up a week later married to a man she'd never met before. You expect me to believe that's coincidence? I expect you to accept that your daughter made a choice you didn't like. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not legality, not coercion, just your pride getting wounded because she chose someone else." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his weapon. Rhett's eyes flicked to him, noted the movement, dismissed it. "I want to hear it from her," Thomas said. "I want her to tell me herself that she wasn't forced, that she wants this arrangement. She doesn't owe you anything. Not an explanation, not her time, nothing. She's still my daughter. You disowned her. In the middle of Main Street, in front of half the town. Rhett's voice held an edge now. You don't get to claim her when it suits you and reject her when it doesn't. The sheriff cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Calder, I really do need to verify that Mrs. Calder is here of her own accord. It's proper procedure. Surely you can understand that. Liora made her decision. She stepped out onto the porch before Rhett could stop her. I'm right here, Sheriff. Every head turned toward her. Her father's face cycled through relief, anger, and something that might have been shame before settling back into hard determination. Liora, he started, but she cut him off. Mrs. Calder, she corrected. That's my legal name now. You made sure I understood that family ties are severed. I want to talk to you, alone. No. The word came out stronger than she'd expected. Thomas blinked, clearly not used to hearing it from her. I'm your father, and I'm a married woman. Anything you need to say, you can say in front of my husband. Rhett had moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the solid presence of him, but not touching, giving her space to fight her own battle while making it clear he was there if she needed him. Sheriff Porter stepped forward. Mrs. Calder, I need to ask you some questions, just to verify everything's proper. Ask them. Did Mr. Calder force you in any way to marry him? Threaten you? Coerce you? No, I asked him to marry me, actually. That was stretching the truth, but technically accurate. She had agreed to his proposal, had made the choice herself. The sheriff looked skeptical. You asked a man you had just met to marry you? I asked a man who'd shown me more respect in 3 days than I'd received in 22 years. A man who offered me freedom instead of ownership. Yes, Sheriff. I asked him. And you weren't afraid? Of his reputation? Liora almost laughed. His reputation is that he minds his own business and doesn't tolerate bullies. I found that admirable, not frightening. One of the hired men spoke up for the first time. Maybe the lady's been convinced she wants this. Stockholm Syndrome, they call it. Happens when captives start identifying with their captors. I wasn't captured, Liora said sharply. I ran to him. There's a difference. From one captor to another, sounds like. Rhett's whole body tensed. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously soft. You want to repeat that? The hired man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Just saying, maybe the little lady doesn't know what's good for her. Maybe she needs someone to make decisions for her own protection. I know exactly what I'm doing, Liora said. And I don't need protection from my husband. I needed it from my father's greed and a lecherous old man who thought he could buy a wife like cattle. Thomas's face went red. How dare you How dare I tell the truth? How dare I say out loud that you sold me to Garrison like I was property? That you took his money and made promises about my life without ever asking what I wanted? Liora's voice was rising now, all the anger and hurt of years pouring out. You want to know if I was coerced? Yes, I was. By you. Every single day of my life, you coerced me into being smaller, quieter, more obedient, until I finally found the courage to say no. The yard went silent. Even the hired men looked uncomfortable. Thomas's hands were shaking. I did what I thought was best. You did what was easiest for you. What made you money? What preserved your pride? Liora descended the porch steps, moving closer to her father. She wasn't afraid anymore. You want to know if this marriage is legal? If it's real? Here's your answer. It's the most real thing I've ever done, because for once in my life, I made the choice. Me, not you. Sheriff Porter cleared his throat. Well, that seems clear enough. Mrs. Calder appears to be here of her own free will, Thomas. I don't see what more I can do. This isn't over, Thomas said, but there was no conviction behind it. He looked smaller somehow, defeated. Yes, it is. Liora's voice was firm. It's been over since the moment I ran. You just didn't want to accept it. The hired men were exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional family drama they'd been dragged into. The sheriff was already moving toward his horse, eager to leave. Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment. Your mother would be ashamed of you. The words were meant to wound, and they did, but Liora stood her ground. My mother would be proud that I found a way out, that I chose freedom over security. She told me once not to let anyone make me small. I'm finally listening. Thomas mounted his horse without another word. The hired men followed suit. As they turned to leave, Garrison rode out of the trees, his face twisted with rage. "This is fraud," he shouted. "I paid good money for that girl." "You paid for something that was never for sale," Rhett said coldly. "That's your problem, not ours. I'll sue. I'll take you both to court." "Do it!" Rhett's voice was ice. "Explain to a judge how you thought you could purchase a human being. I'm sure that'll go well for you." Garrison's horse danced nervously under him. "You think you're so smart, Calder. You think you've won. But this town won't forget. Neither will I. I'm counting on it." The threat in those 3 words was unmistakable. Garrison paled, yanked his horse around, and followed Thomas and the others back into the trees. Liora stood in the yard, watching them disappear, feeling like she'd just survived something enormous. Her legs were shaking, her hands were trembling, but she'd done it. She'd faced her father down and won. Rhett's hand touched her shoulder gently. "You should sit down." "I'm fine." "You're shaking like a leaf. Come inside." She let him guide her back to the porch, then into the house. He sat her down at the table and poured her a glass of water. She drank it in one long gulp, her throat suddenly parched. "That was stupid," Rhett said, but there was no anger in his voice. "Coming out when I told you to stay inside." "They wanted to hear it from me, and I wanted to say it." Liora set down the glass. "I'm tired of other people speaking for me, deciding for me. I needed them to hear the truth." "The truth being that you asked me to marry you?" "Did I not? In essence?" A ghost of a smile crossed Rhett's face. "I suppose you did. In a roundabout way." They sat in silence for a moment. Liora could feel the adrenaline draining out of her system, leaving her exhausted. "My father's not going to give up," she said quietly. "Neither will Garrison. They'll find some way to make trouble. Let them try. The law's on our side now. The marriage is legal, properly witnessed, and you just declared in front of a sheriff that you're here willingly. They've got no ground to stand on." "You don't know my father. He doesn't need legal ground. He just needs to be mean enough and persistent enough." "Then he'll learn something new." Rhett stood, moved to the window. "He'll learn that some people can't be intimidated." Liora watched him standing there, backlit by afternoon sun, and felt something shift inside her chest. This man had given her everything: freedom, protection, a home, respect, and asked for nothing in return. She'd been so focused on what the marriage meant legally that she hadn't stopped to think about what it meant personally. "Why did you really do this?" she asked suddenly. "Marry me, I mean. You said it was practical, but there had to be easier ways to help me." Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his back still to her. "I told you I had a sister," he said finally. "Sarah. What I didn't tell you was that she was engaged once, before she met her husband, to a man our father chose for her. A good match, on paper. Wealthy family, good prospects." He turned to face her, and Liora saw old pain in his eyes. He beat her, not often enough that anyone noticed, not badly enough that she could prove it, just enough to keep her afraid, to keep her compliant. And when she finally found the courage to break it off, he spread rumors about her, said she was unstable, improper, damaged goods. It took her 5 years to find someone willing to marry her despite the gossip. Liora's heart clenched. "I was overseas when most of it happened. Military service. By the time I came home, she'd already married and moved away. But I saw what those years did to her, how they hollowed her out." Rhett's jaw tightened. "I swore if I ever had the chance to help someone in a similar situation, I would. No questions asked. No conditions." "So I'm not the first person you've helped?" "You're the first I've married. But no, not the first I've helped escape a bad situation." He smiled faintly. "Turns out having a fearsome reputation is useful for protecting people who need it." Something warm bloomed in Liora's chest. This man who everyone feared was actually out here quietly saving people the world had forgotten. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me as worth saving. You saved yourself. I just provided the paperwork." But they both knew that wasn't quite true. The next few weeks settled into a new normal. Word of the confrontation spread through town, and gradually people stopped watching them with quite so much suspicion when they came in for supplies. Some folks remained hostile, friends of her father, business associates of Garrison, but others started nodding politely. A few even spoke to them. The biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. Liora was at the general store one afternoon, selecting fabric for new curtains, when a woman approached her. Clara Morrison, wife to one of the three brothers Rhett had put in the hospital years ago. "Mrs. Calder?" she said quietly. Liora tensed, expecting hostility or worse. But Clara's face was nervous, not angry. "Mrs. Morrison, I wanted to thank you." Liora blinked. "Thank me? For what your husband did. To my brothers-in-law." Clara's voice dropped even lower. "Everyone thinks he attacked them out of nowhere, that he's violent and unpredictable, but that's not what happened." "What did happen?" Clara glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "They were extorting money from families all over the valley, including mine. My husband's too scared of his brothers to stand up to them, but when they tried it with Mr. Calder, he didn't just pay them off. He put a stop to it, permanently." She pressed a small package into Leora's hands. "I bake bread, good bread. I'd like to bring you some each week, if you'll allow it, as thanks." Liora looked down at the package, then back at Clara's earnest face. "You don't have to do that." "I know, I want to. Your husband gave my family something we'd lost. Hope that maybe someone could stand up to bullies and win." Clara smiled tentatively. "And I think you might understand something about that yourself." Over the following month, more people came. Not many, not the majority, but enough to matter. A farmer whose daughter Rhett had helped get to a teaching position 2 towns over. A widow whose property Rhett had protected from claim jumpers. A merchant whose shop had been saved when Rhett had stopped a fire from spreading. Each one had a story about the dangerous man in the Blackwood who'd actually been their salvation. Liora started to understand that Rhett's fearsome reputation was carefully cultivated for a reason. It kept certain people away while attracting exactly the kind of people who needed help. The town saw a dangerous loner. The desperate saw a last resort. And slowly, Liora began to see something else entirely. She noticed how he'd set aside the best cuts of meat for her at dinner. How he'd fixed the squeaky hinge on her bedroom door without mentioning it. How he made sure her favorite coffee was always stocked, even though it cost more and had to be special ordered. Small things. Thoughtful things. Things that spoke of care rather than mere partnership. One evening, she found him on the porch, playing the violin she'd noticed that first day. The music was haunting, beautiful, filled with longing and sadness. She stood in the doorway listening until he finished. "I didn't know you played," she said. "I don't much. Not anymore." He set the violin down carefully. "It was my mother's. She taught all her children. Sarah took to it better than I did. It sounded beautiful to me. You're kind to say so." Liora sat in the other rocking chair. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Can I ask you something personal?" she ventured. "You can ask." "I may not answer." "Why did you really leave the army? Why come out here and build this life alone?" Rhett was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he sighed. "I was engaged once, before the military, before all of this. Her name was Catherine." His voice was carefully neutral, but Liora heard the pain underneath. "We were young. We had plans. I was going to serve my time, come home, marry her, build a life. What happened? War happened. I was gone longer than expected. 3 years became 5, became 7. And Catherine," he paused, "she waited as long as she could. Then she married someone else, someone who was there, who could give her the life she wanted when she wanted it. I'm sorry. Don't be. She made the right choice. I was a different person when I finally came home. Harder, damaged in ways that don't show. Catherine deserved better than what I'd become." He looked at Liora. "So I came out here. Bought land where no one knew me, where I could build something new without the weight of who I used to be." Liora felt a lump in her throat. "Do you still love her?" "I love the memory of who we were. But that's different from loving who she is now, or who I am. We're both strangers to those young people who made promises they couldn't keep." The honesty in his words struck her. This man who seemed so strong, so unshakable, was carrying his own heartbreak, His own scars. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "Seemed only fair. You've shared your story. Only right I share mine." They rocked in silence, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Liora felt something settling inside her, a sense of rightness, of belonging. This strange marriage they'd entered into for purely practical reasons was becoming something else, something that felt dangerously close to real. Summer came to the valley in waves of heat that made the air shimmer above the fields. Liora stood in the garden she'd spent 2 months cultivating, wiping sweat from her forehead as she surveyed rows of tomatoes, beans, squash, and herbs that had flourished under her careful tending. The garden had been Rhett's idea. Give her something that was entirely hers to manage, to nurture, to claim. She'd made it thrive. "Looking good," Rhett called from where he was repairing the chicken coop. "Better than anything I ever managed to grow." "That's because you treated plants like soldiers. I treat them like they need care." Liora gathered a basket of tomatoes, their skins still warm from the sun. "We'll have enough to sell at market this week. Your garden, your money." It had been like that for months now. Everything she contributed, eggs from chickens she'd started managing, preserves she'd learned to make, vegetables from her garden. The profits were hers. Rhett had opened an account at the bank in her name, insisted she keep every cent she earned. "You're building independence," he'd said when she'd protested. "Real independence means having your own money, your own means." Now that account held more than she'd ever possessed in her life. Not a fortune, but enough to make her feel secure. Enough to know that if she ever needed to leave, she could. The thought of leaving made her chest tighten in a way it hadn't 3 months ago. She carried the tomatoes inside, set them on the counter, and started preparing lunch. Through the window, she could see Rhett working, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his movements efficient and sure. He'd stopped being a stranger somewhere along the way, had become something else, friend, partner, the person whose presence she looked forward to at the end of each day. The boundaries of their arrangement had started to blur. It happened in small ways. The way he'd taken to touching her lower back when he passed behind her in the kitchen. How she'd started running her fingers through his hair when she noticed it was getting too long, offering to trim it. The way their goodnights had evolved from curt nods to lingering moments at the base of the stairs, neither quite ready to separate for the night. They hadn't talked about it, hadn't acknowledged the shift, but it was there, humming beneath every interaction like a current waiting to become lightning. Clara Morrison arrived that afternoon with her weekly bread delivery, but this time she wasn't alone. 3 other women accompanied her, wives of farmers and merchants who'd heard about the strange marriage between the runaway daughter and the feared hermit and had come to see for themselves. Liora invited them in with some trepidation, uncertain what to expect, but Clara had chosen her companions well. These were women who understood difficult choices, who'd made their own compromises with life. "We wanted to meet you properly," said Martha Green, a sturdy woman in her 40s whose husband ran the feed store. "Without all the men and the drama and the nonsense." They sat around Leora's table drinking coffee and eating Clara's bread, and slowly the conversation moved from pleasantries to something deeper. These women had questions, not hostile ones, but genuinely curious. What was it like living so far from town? Wasn't she lonely? How did she manage with a husband who had such a reputation? Liora found herself answering honestly. Yes, it was isolated, but she'd found peace in the isolation. No, she wasn't lonely. Rhett was better company than most people she'd known in town. And his reputation was just that, reputation. The reality was a man who'd shown her nothing but respect and kindness. "He lets you keep your own money?" Martha asked, surprised. "Insists on it. And he doesn't expect things?" This from Sarah Chen, whose knowing look made clear what she was asking. "He's been a perfect gentleman. We have separate rooms, separate lives in many ways." Liora paused. "It's not a conventional marriage, but it works for us." "Sounds like a better arrangement than half the conventional marriages I know," Clara said dryly. "At least you're treated like an equal partner." The conversation flowed easily after that. Martha told stories about her daughters, both married now and living in neighboring towns. Sarah shared her struggles managing her husband's shop while raising 4 children. And slowly, without Liora quite realizing it was happening, these women began treating her not as Thomas Vance's wayward daughter or Rhett Calder's mysterious wife, but simply as one of them, a woman making her way in a hard world. You should come to our quilting circle, Martha said as they prepared to leave. Every Thursday afternoon at the community hall, we work on projects for families in need mostly, but it's also just a chance to talk without the men hovering around telling us we're doing it wrong. I'd like that, Liora said, and meant it. The women stayed for 2 hours, and when they left, each one hugged Liora like she was already part of their circle. It was the first time since leaving her father's house that she'd felt the warmth of female friendship, of community. You made quite an impression, Rhett observed that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Clara was singing your praises all over town, apparently. Said you've got more sense than most women twice your age. They're good people. I'm glad they came. So am I. He was quiet for a moment. You're building a life here. A real one. I'm glad to see it. Liora looked at him in the fading light. Is that what you wanted? When you offered to marry me? I wanted you to have choices. What you did with them was up to you. He met her eyes. You've done well, Liora. Better than well. You've become someone the town respects. Because of you. Because your protection gave me the space to become that person. No. Because you had the strength in you all along. You just needed the chance to let it out. The words settled over her like a benediction. For so long she'd defined herself by what she'd escaped from. But Rhett was right. She'd built something new here, something that was entirely hers. They sat in silence for a while, the air between them charged with something neither had named yet. Finally Rhett stood, offered her his hand. Walk with me? They wandered into the trees behind the house, following a path Rhett had cleared months ago. The woods were alive with evening sounds, birds settling for the night, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the creek singing its endless song over stones. I need to tell you something, Rhett said as they walked. Something I should have said weeks ago, but kept putting off because I was afraid it would complicate things. Liora's heart began to pound. What is it? He stopped in a small clearing where moonlight filtered through the canopy above. This arrangement we have, this marriage of convenience, it stopped being convenient for me a long time ago. What do you mean? I mean I've been lying to myself, telling myself I was just helping you, just giving you protection and space to grow, but the truth is somewhere along the way I started wanting more than that. He looked at her directly. I started wanting you, not as a responsibility or a housemate, as a wife, a real one. Liora felt like all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Rhett, I know this isn't what we agreed to. I know I promised this would be temporary, just paperwork, no expectations. And if you want to keep it that way, I'll respect that. But I needed you to know the truth. Needed you to understand that if you're feeling confused about the way things have been between us lately, it's because I've been feeling the same way and not doing a very good job of hiding it. She stared at him, this man who'd given her everything and asked for nothing, now standing vulnerable before her in the moonlight. You think I haven't noticed? She asked softly. The way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention? The way you find excuses to touch my hand or stand close to me? I've noticed, Rhett. I've noticed everything. And I've been terrified to say anything because I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was projecting what I wanted onto innocent gestures. She stepped closer to him. But I'm not imagining this, am I? The way my heart races when you're near, the way I look for you first thing every morning, the way I dream about you at night. Rhett's breath caught. Liora, I don't want to keep separate rooms anymore, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't want to pretend this is just a legal arrangement. I want it to be real, all of it. I want you. He pulled her to him then, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line... I'm sure. I've been sure for weeks. I was just waiting for you to realize it too. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the chaste peck they'd shared at their wedding. This was deep and searching, full of months of restrained desire, finally unleashed. Liora melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressed against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rhett rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he whispered. I think I've loved you since that first night when you stood up to your father on my porch. You were so scared but so brave, and I thought, This is someone worth fighting for. I love you too, Liora said, and felt the truth of it resonate in her bones. I didn't know what love was supposed to feel like. I thought it was supposed to hurt, supposed to make you small. But this, what I feel for you, it makes me bigger, stronger, more myself. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and that night, for the first time, Liora didn't sleep in the guest room. She fell asleep in Rhett's arms, in the bed they would share from that night forward, feeling safer and more loved than she'd ever imagined possible. The trouble came 3 days later. Liora was at the market selling her produce when she noticed a commotion near the livery stable. Men were gathering, their voices raised in anger. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something had happened. Something bad. One of the farmers she'd befriended, John Hastings, came rushing over. "Mrs. Calder, you need to get home. Now." "What's wrong?" "Your father's spreading lies. Says your husband's been threatening him, making it impossible for him to do business. He's got half the town worked up, saying Calder's trying to run him out of the valley." John's face was grim. "And Garrison's backing him up. They're saying Calder's been intimidating other ranchers too, trying to take over the whole territory." Leora's stomach dropped. "That's not true. Rhett hasn't gone near my father's property. He hasn't threatened anyone." "Doesn't matter if it's true. Your father's convincing, and he's got Garrison backing him up financially. They've hired some men, rough types from the mining camps. They're talking about riding out to your place tonight to teach Calder a lesson about respecting his betters." The basket of tomatoes slipped from Leora's hands, spilling across the ground. "They're planning to attack our home?" "That's what I'm hearing. Some of the hotheads are eating it up, talking about frontier justice and protecting the community from dangerous outsiders." John gripped her shoulder. "Get home. Warn your husband. And maybe think about getting somewhere safe for a few days until this blows over." Liora didn't waste time gathering her produce. She climbed onto her horse and rode for home faster than she'd ever ridden in her life, her mind racing. This was her father's final play. If he couldn't control her, couldn't reclaim her, he'd destroy what she'd built, destroy the man she loved. She found Rhett in the barn, oblivious to the storm gathering in town. When she told him what was happening, his expression went cold and hard. "Of course," he said quietly. "I should have expected this. Your father's not the type to accept defeat. He's been waiting for the right moment to strike back." "What are we going to do?" "We? Nothing. I'm going to ride into town and settle this before it gets worse." "Alone? Rhett, there could be 20 men or more. Then I'll handle 20 men." He was already saddling his horse, his movements quick and efficient. "You stay here. Lock the doors. Load the rifle I showed you how to use. If anyone comes who isn't me, you don't answer. You don't engage. You protect yourself. I'm not hiding while you face a mob alone." Rhett stopped, turned to face her fully. "Liora, this is exactly what your father wants. He wants to provoke a confrontation he can use to paint me as the aggressor. If I bring you, he'll use it to claim I'm controlling you, that you're my prisoner, that everything people have been whispering about is true. The only way to win this is to face him on my own terms, in public, where witnesses can see I'm not the monster he's making me out to be. And what if he set a trap? What if this is all designed to get you alone where he can—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the thought too terrible to voice. Rhett's expression softened slightly. He reached out, cupped her face in his calloused hand. "I've survived worse than Thomas Vance and a bunch of hired thugs. Trust me." "I do trust you, but that doesn't mean I'm not terrified of losing you." Her voice broke. "I just found you, Rhett. I just let myself love you. I can't lose you now." He pulled her close, held her tight. "You won't. I promise you won't. But I need to do this right. I need to face them in the light of day, in front of the whole town, so there's no doubt about who the real villains are." Liora wanted to argue, wanted to insist on coming with him, but she knew he was right. Her presence would only complicate things, give her father ammunition to use against them. "Come back to me," she whispered against his chest. "Always." But Liora couldn't just wait at home, helpless and terrified. She gave Rhett a 20-minute head start, then saddled her own horse and followed at a distance. If her father wanted a confrontation, he was going to get one, but not the one he'd planned for. She took the long route, circling around through the woods so she'd arrive from a different direction. By the time she reached town, a crowd had gathered in the street outside the saloon. At least 40 men, maybe more. with her father at the center holding court like some kind of deposed king rallying his troops. Garrison stood beside him, looking smug and self-satisfied. And there was Rhett, sitting calmly on his horse in the middle of the street, surrounded but not cowering. "Threatening honest businessmen," Thomas was saying, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd, "making it impossible for decent folk to make a living. He's trying to take over this valley, one intimidated family at a time. How long are we going to let this man terrorize our community?" "I haven't threatened anyone," Rhett said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. "Haven't set foot on your property, Vance. Haven't interfered with your business in any way. You're lying, and everyone here knows it. You stole my daughter. Your daughter chose to leave. There's a difference. You manipulated her. Took advantage of a confused girl who didn't know what she was doing." "I'm not confused." Every head turned. Liora urged her horse through the crowd, ignoring Rhett's sharp look of frustration mixed with resignation. She positioned herself beside him, facing her father across the sea of onlookers. "I'm not confused, and I'm not manipulated," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I made a choice, the same choice I'd make again today, tomorrow, and every day after." Thomas's face was red with rage, and something else, something that might have been desperation. He was losing control, and he knew it. "You don't know what you're saying. This man has poisoned your mind against your own family. You poisoned my mind against family all by yourself," Liora interrupted. "Every time you hit me for speaking out of turn, every time you locked me in my room for disagreeing with you, every time you reminded me that I was property to be sold to the highest bidder, you did that, not Rhett." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people looked shocked. Clearly they hadn't known the extent of Thomas's abuse. Others looked uncomfortable, as if they'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. "She's lying," Thomas shouted. I was trying to protect her, to give her a good life." "By selling me to a man who'd already buried 2 wives?" Liora's voice rose. "By taking Garrison's money and making promises about my future without ever asking what I wanted? That's protection?" "Those wives died in childbirth," Garrison interjected, his face flushing. "Natural causes. I loved both of them." "Did you?" Liora turned to face him directly. "Because I've talked to people who knew them. Sarah was 19 when she died, supposedly in childbirth, except she was only 4 months along, and there were bruises on her arms that Doc Peterson noted in his records. Emma was 21, and she told her sister the week before she died that she was afraid of you, that you had a temper that came out when you'd been drinking." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Garrison's face went from red to purple. "Where did you get—" "Those records are private. Doc Peterson is a friend now," Liora said simply. "And he's concerned enough about the pattern that he's been keeping detailed notes, just in case someone ever needed them." Sheriff Porter, who'd been standing at the edge of the crowd looking deeply uncomfortable, stepped forward. "Is this true, Garrison? Because if there's evidence of foul play—" "There's no evidence of anything," Garrison sputtered. "This is slander. I'll sue—" "You'll do nothing," said a new voice. Reverend Pike emerged from the crowd, and Liora felt a surge of gratitude. "Because I've been doing some investigating of my own, talking to people, gathering testimony. And what I've found is disturbing enough that I've already sent a formal complaint to the territorial marshal." "You had no right." "I had every right. 2 young women are dead under suspicious circumstances. That's not just gossip, Garrison. That's a pattern that needs investigation." The crowd was buzzing now, people talking in urgent whispers. Liora could see the balance shifting, could feel the tide turning against her father and Garrison. But Thomas wasn't done. "Fine. Maybe Garrison's not a saint, but that doesn't change the fact that Calder is dangerous, that he's threatened people." "Name one," Rhett said calmly. "Name one person I've threatened who didn't try to hurt someone else first." "The Morrison brothers." "We're extorting families all over the valley," Clara Morrison called out, stepping through the crowd. Her husband Jake stood beside her, looking sheepish but determined. "Tell them, Jake. Tell them what your brothers were doing." Jake Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. "They were running protection rackets, making people pay for security or bad things would happen to their property. I knew about it, but was too scared to stop them. When they tried it on Calder, he didn't just pay up. He defended himself. What happened to my brothers? They earned it. He helped my family when we were being driven off our land by claim jumpers, Martha Green added. Never asked for payment, just helped because it was right. He put out a fire at my shop, the dry goods merchant called out. Saved the whole block from burning. He helped my daughter get safe passage when her own father tried to marry her off to a man 3 times her age, someone else shouted. More voices joined in, people coming forward with stories Liora had never heard. The dangerous hermit was being revealed for what he actually was, a man who helped people who had nowhere else to turn. Thomas looked around wildly as his support crumbled, as the mob he'd tried to assemble turned against him. You're all being fooled. He's got you all convinced. The only person trying to fool anyone is you, Sheriff Porter said, stepping forward. He looked uncomfortable but determined. I've been doing some investigating too, Thomas. Had some time to think after that last confrontation. And I've got 3 witnesses who say you tried to hire men to burn down Calder's barn. That's arson conspiracy. That's a serious crime. The crowd gasped. Thomas went pale. That's a lie. Who told you that? The men you tried to hire. They came forward when they heard you were planning something bigger. Seems even hired guns have limits. The sheriff looked at Garrison. And I've got banking records that show you've been buying up debts from families all over the valley, foreclosing on properties the minute they miss a single payment. Legal, maybe, but it paints a picture of who the real predators are around here. Garrison's smugness evaporated. You can't prove I've done anything illegal. Maybe not, but I can make your life very difficult. And when the territorial marshal gets here to investigate those suspicious deaths, I imagine he'll be very interested in your business practices too. The crowd was turning hostile now, not toward Rhett, but toward Thomas and Garrison. People were angry, realizing they'd been manipulated, that they'd almost participated in something terrible based on lies. Thomas stood in the middle of the street looking smaller than Liora had ever seen him, his power base crumbling around him. For a moment she almost felt sorry for him. This man who'd once seemed so large and terrifying, now revealed as just another bully who'd gotten away with it for too long. Garrison was already mounting his horse, clearly wanting to distance himself from the disaster. This isn't over, he muttered, but no one was listening to him anymore. Yes, it is, Liora said quietly, but her voice carried in the sudden hush. It's been over for months. You just refuse to see it. Thomas looked at his daughter, and for the first time in her life, she saw something other than anger or contempt in his eyes. She saw defeat, regret, maybe even shame. I did what I thought was right, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. No. You did what was easiest for you, what preserved your pride and filled your pockets. Leora's voice was firm, but not cruel. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. Done being afraid of you. Done trying to earn your approval. Done letting your choices define my life. She turned her horse and rode away, Rhett beside her. Behind them, the crowd began to disperse, people talking in low voices, the energy of potential violence dissipating into gossip and speculation. They didn't speak until they were out of town, riding through the Blackwood toward home. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and green. You were supposed to stay at the house, Rhett said finally, but there was no real anger in his voice. I know. You deliberately disobeyed a direct instruction. I did. Why? Liora looked at him. Because you're my husband. Because I wasn't going to let you face that alone. Because I love you. And love means standing beside someone even when it's dangerous. Especially when it's dangerous. Rhett reined in his horse. They sat in the dappled shade, facing each other. You know what's going to happen now, don't you? He asked. Tell me. Your father's finished in this valley. The marshal will investigate Garrison, and whether they find enough to prosecute or not, his reputation is destroyed. The town knows the truth now. They'll never look at either of them the same way. Good. And they'll look at us differently too. We won't be the scandal anymore. We'll just be us. Is that what you want? I want whatever makes you happy, Liora. If that's staying here, building our life, then that's what we do. If you want to move somewhere no one knows our story, start completely fresh. I'll do that too. She considered it, the idea of leaving, of going somewhere they could just be a normal couple without history or baggage. But then she thought about the house Rhett had built, the garden she'd tended, the women who'd become her friends, the community that was slowly accepting them. I want to stay, she said. I want to prove that we can build something real here, that we're more than just the scandal we started as." Rhett smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Then we stay." They rode the rest of the way home, side by side, fingers intertwined between their horses. And when they reached the house, Liora felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of belonging, of home. That evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and Rhett pulled her close. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside was a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small pendant shaped like a compass rose. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly expensive. "It was my mother's," Rhett said quietly. "She gave it to my father when they got married. Said it was a symbol. No matter where life took them, they'd always find their way back to each other. My father gave it to me before he died. Said to give it to someone who understood what it meant." Leora's eyes filled with tears. "Rhett, you ran into the unknown," he said, fastening it around her neck. "And you found your way here, to me, to home. That takes courage most people never find." She touched the pendant, feeling its weight against her skin. "Thank you for this, for everything. Thank you for choosing me, for seeing past the reputation to who I actually am." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, and Liora felt a peace she'd never known before. She'd run from one life and stumbled into another, and somehow against all odds, she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for. Love, freedom, home. Not just a place, but a person. Someone who saw her as she truly was and loved her not despite her flaws, but because of her strength, her courage, her refusal to be anything other than herself. The weeks that followed brought profound changes to Grafton's Bend. The territorial marshal arrived and began his investigation into Garrison's former wives. While he ultimately couldn't prove murder, too much time had passed, too much evidence lost, the inquiry revealed enough suspicious circumstances that Garrison was quietly encouraged to leave the territory. He sold his holdings at a loss and disappeared, and no one mourned his departure. Thomas stayed, but he was a broken man. The respect he'd commanded through fear and intimidation evaporated overnight. Families he'd bullied for years stopped deferring to him. Business partners found reasons to work with others. Slowly, methodically, he was being frozen out of the community he'd once dominated. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the confrontation in town, he appeared at Rhett and Leora's door. Rhett saw him first and tensed, but Liora put a hand on his arm. "Let me talk to him." She walked out to meet her father alone. He'd aged dramatically in those 2 months. His hair had gone completely gray, his face was gaunt, and he moved like a much older man. "I'm selling the ranch," Thomas said without preamble. "Moving east to live with your Aunt Margaret. Figured you should know." "All right. I also wanted to—" He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I wanted to apologize for everything, for how I treated you, for trying to sell you off, for the lies I spread about your husband. I was wrong about all of it." Liora studied her father's face, looking for sincerity. She found it, along with genuine shame and regret. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I'm leaving and I didn't want to go without at least trying to make it right. I know I can't undo the damage. I know you'll never forgive me and you shouldn't, but I needed you to hear me say it. I was wrong. You were right to leave, right to marry Calder, right about everything." It was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever gotten from him. Part of her, the hurt little girl who'd spent years trying to earn her father's approval, wanted to cling to it, to let it mean something. But the woman she'd become knew better. "I appreciate you saying that," she said carefully, "but it doesn't change anything. The apology doesn't erase years of abuse. It doesn't make us family again. I know, I needed to say it anyway." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Thomas cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, he seems like a good man. Your husband. Better than I gave him credit for." "He is the best man I've ever known." "Then I'm glad you found him, even if I hate how it happened." Thomas turned to leave, then paused. "Your mother would be proud of you, of who you've become. I should have told you that years ago." He walked away before Liora could respond, and she watched him go with mixed feelings. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful forgiveness, just an acknowledgement of truth and a parting of ways that felt final. Rhett came out onto the porch and slipped his arm around her waist. "You all right?" "Yeah, I think I am." She leaned into him. "It's strange. I spent so many years wanting his approval, wanting him to see me as worthy, and now that he finally does, it doesn't matter anymore. I don't need his validation. That's growth. That's freedom." They stood together watching Thomas's retreating figure disappear into the trees, and Liora felt a chapter of her life closing. Not with drama or fireworks, but with quiet acceptance. The seasons changed, and life on the frontier settled into its natural rhythm. Liora threw herself into the community with enthusiasm. She joined Martha's quilting circle and became known for her skill with intricate patterns. She started teaching some of the younger girls in town how to read and write, holding informal classes in her home twice a week. She expanded her garden and began supplying several families with fresh vegetables, building a small but steady business. And slowly, the story of how she and Rhett came to be married transformed from scandal into something else. A love story. The town's perception shifted as people saw them together, saw the genuine affection and respect between them, saw how they built their life as true partners. One evening in late autumn, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Liora realized she was completely, utterly happy. Not the tentative, fearful happiness of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop, but the solid, unshakable contentment of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged. "What are you thinking about?" Rhett asked, looking up from the book he was reading. "About how different my life is now. How different I am. Better, different, or worse different? Better in every way." She set down her sewing. "A year ago I was terrified, trapped, convinced I had no power over my own life. And now look at me. I have friends, a business, a home, a husband I actually love instead of one I was sold to. Sometimes I can't believe this is real. It's real." Rhett set aside his book and pulled her into his lap. "And it's only going to get better." "How could it possibly get better than this?" He kissed her softly. "We could start thinking about the future, about what comes next." "What did you have in mind?" "Maybe expanding the house, adding a few more rooms." "Why would we need more rooms?" Rhett's eyes held a question and a hope that made Leora's breath catch. "For the family we might want someday, if that's something you'd want." Liora had never let herself think about children. In her father's house, the idea of bringing a child into that environment had been horrifying. With Garrison, it had been a death sentence, literally, based on what happened to his previous wives. But with Rhett, the idea didn't terrify her. It filled her with wonder. "I'd want that," she whispered. "Someday. When we're ready. No rush. We have all the time in the world." They sat together in front of the fire, making quiet plans for a future that stretched out before them full of possibility. And later, as they lay in bed with Leora's head resting on Rhett's chest, she thought about the girl who'd run into the storm all those months ago. That girl had been so scared, so desperate, so certain she was choosing death over obedience. She'd had no idea she was actually choosing life. Winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in snow by November. Liora loved the winter, loved how the house felt cozy and safe when storms raged outside, loved the quiet beauty of the blackwood covered in white, loved the long evenings by the fire with Rhett. They were snowed in for 3 days in December, and during that time something shifted between them again. The passion that had flared between them in summer had settled into something deeper. A partnership so complete that they moved around each other like parts of the same organism. On the third night, as wind howled outside and snow piled high against the windows, Liora looked up from the bread she was kneading and found Rhett watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "What?" she asked. "I'm trying to figure out what I did to deserve you. You gave me freedom, respect, love, a home. You gave me all that too. More, actually. You gave me purpose again. Something to build for beyond just survival." Liora wiped flour from her hands and crossed to where he sat. She settled onto his lap, her arms around his neck. "We saved each other," she said simply. "That's what this is. Two people who were lost finding their way together." He kissed her, slow and deep, And when they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. "I have something to tell you," Liora said. "I was going to wait until I was more certain, but I can't keep it to myself anymore." "What is it?" "I think I'm pregnant." Rhett went very still. "You think?" "I'm late. Over 2 weeks now. And I've been feeling strange in the mornings. Not sick exactly, but different. I was going to wait to see Doc Peterson until the snow cleared, but—" She touched his face. "I wanted you to know, even if I'm wrong." For a long moment, Rhett just stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, wonder, and then pure joy. Then he let out a laugh that was almost a sob and pulled her tight against him. "A baby," he said into her hair. "We're going to have a baby. Maybe. Probably. I'm not completely sure yet." "But you think so?" "Yes, I think so." They held each other while the storm raged outside, and Liora felt something settle inside her, a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she'd been running toward without knowing it. Not just freedom from her father, but freedom to build the life she actually wanted. To choose love, partnership, family on her own terms. When the snow finally cleared, Doc Peterson confirmed what Liora already knew. She was pregnant, about 8 weeks along, and if everything went well, they'd have a baby in early summer. The news spread through town with remarkable speed, and the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Women who'd been cautiously friendly became openly warm, offering advice and help. Men who'd feared Rhett started treating him like any other expectant father, offering congratulations and unsolicited parenting wisdom. Clara organized a celebration at the community hall, a party that half the town attended. Liora stood in the center of it all, accepting hugs and well wishes, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. A year ago, she'd been an outcast, running for her life. Now she was beloved, celebrated, surrounded by community. Martha pulled her aside during the party. "You've done something remarkable, you know." "What's that?" "You've shown people that there's more than one way to build a life, that you can choose love instead of duty, and have it work out beautifully. You and Rhett, you've given hope to a lot of women who thought they were stuck with whatever hand life dealt them." Liora looked around the room, at the faces of women she'd come to know and care for. How many of them were in marriages they hadn't chosen? How many had compromised themselves to meet others' expectations? "I just did what I had to do to survive," she said. "Maybe, but you did it with grace and courage, and people noticed that." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through winter and into spring. Leora's body changed, rounding and softening, and she found herself marveling at the life growing inside her. Rhett was attentive almost to a fault, constantly worried she was overdoing it, insisting she rest more than she wanted to. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him one afternoon when he tried to take over her garden work. "I know. I just want to make sure you're safe, that you're both safe." His protectiveness was endearing, if sometimes excessive. But Liora understood where it came from. He'd lost so much in his life, and the thought of losing her or their child terrified him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. In May, 2 weeks before her due date, Thomas Vance came back one last time. He arrived in the morning, looking even more aged and worn than he had at their last meeting. Rhett saw him first and moved to intercept, but Liora, heavy with pregnancy and moving slowly, called out, "It's all right. Let him approach." Thomas dismounted carefully and walked toward the porch where Liora sat in her rocking chair, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "I heard you were expecting," he said awkwardly. I wanted to see you before the baby came, if that's all right." "Why?" "Because I'm dying. Cancer, the doctors say. Got maybe a month, possibly less, and I couldn't go without—" He struggled for words. "Without seeing my grandchild, even if just from a distance." Liora felt a complicated swirl of emotions, anger at his presumption, pity for his situation, and underneath it all, a faint echo of the love she'd once felt for him before everything went wrong. "You disowned me," she said quietly, "in front of the whole town. You said I was dead to you." "I know, I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." Thomas's voice shook. "I don't deserve to be called grandfather. I know that. But I wanted to tell you." He took a shaky breath. "Your mother would be so proud of you, of the woman you've become. of the life you've built. She always said you had more strength in you than anyone gave you credit for. I should have listened." Leora's eyes stung with unexpected tears. She'd thought herself done crying over her father, done caring what he thought. But apparently some wounds ran deeper than she'd realized. "She would be proud," Leora agreed, "because I finally did what she told me to do. I stopped letting people make me small." "You did, and I'm sorry I was one of the people who tried to make you small in the first place. I'm sorry for all of it, Leora. I'm so damn sorry." Rhett had moved to stand behind Leora's chair, his hand on her shoulder. A silent show of support, letting her know he was there if she needed him. "What do you want from me?" Leora asked. "Forgiveness? Absolution? I don't deserve either of those. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I couldn't see before. That you're strong, capable. That you made the right choice running from me. The right choice marrying Rhett. The right choice in everything." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then, surprising herself, Leora spoke. "Would you like to stay for lunch?" Thomas looked shocked. You'd let me? I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. So I don't have to wonder later if I should have given you one more chance to be human." She struggled to her feet, Rhett helping her up. "One meal. You can meet my husband properly. See the home I've built. And then you leave and don't come back. Those are the terms. I accept them. Gratefully." Lunch was awkward but not hostile. Thomas was painfully polite, clearly uncomfortable but trying. He asked Rhett about the land, the house, the plans for expansion. He complimented Leora's cooking. He talked about his sister Margaret, how she'd been kind to take him in despite their years of estrangement. And slowly, over the course of that meal, Leora saw her father not as the monster who'd dominated her childhood, but as a broken, dying old man who'd finally realized too late what he'd lost. When it came time for him to leave, he paused at the door. "Could I—" He gestured hesitantly toward Leora's belly. "Could I feel the baby? Just once?" Leora hesitated, then nodded. Thomas placed his weathered hand against her stomach, and as if on cue, the baby kicked hard enough that he could feel it. His eyes filled with tears. "Strong, just like the mother." "Yes, just like the mother." He pulled his hand away, nodded at Rhett, and walked to his horse. Before mounting, he turned back one last time. "I hope it's a girl," he said. "I hope she has your courage and your strength, and I hope you're a better parent to her than I was to you." "I will be. That's a promise." Thomas rode away, and Leora knew with certainty she'd never see him again. 2 weeks later, word came that he'd died in his sleep at his sister's house. Peaceful, they said, like he'd finally found rest. Leora didn't go to the funeral, but she did stand at her window the day they buried him and say a quiet goodbye to the complicated man who'd given her life, and then tried to take it back. She forgave him, not for his sake, but for her own, so she could move forward without carrying the weight of that anger into her new life. 5 days after Thomas was buried, Liora went into labor. It was a warm June morning, and she'd been in the garden when the first pains hit. Rhett was immediately by her side, nearly panicking despite all the preparation they'd done. "It's all right," she told him, even as another contraction gripped her. "This is normal. Go get Doc Peterson and Martha. I'll be fine." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to. I need them here, and you're the fastest rider. Go." He went, though clearly hating every second of it. Leora made her way into the house, following all the advice Martha and the other women had given her. She laid out towels, filled basins with water, did all the practical things that kept her mind occupied and her fear at bay. The labor was long, 16 hours from first pain to final push. Doc Peterson arrived and took charge with calm efficiency. Martha came and held Leora's hand, talked her through the contractions, told her when to push and when to breathe. And Rhett stayed by her side the entire time, his face pale and drawn, his hand gripping hers so tight her bones ached. But she didn't care. She held on to him like an anchor, and together they brought their daughter into the world. Catherine Sarah Calder was born just after midnight, screaming her fury at being displaced from her warm, safe home. She was tiny and red and perfect, and when Doc Peterson placed her in Leora's arms, Leora felt her heart crack open with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "She's beautiful," Rhett whispered, his voice breaking. "You're both beautiful." "We made this," Leora said in wonder, staring down at their daughter's scrunched face. "We made a person." "We did." They sat together in the lamplight, their daughter between them, and Liora thought about the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment. From that terrified girl running into a storm to this, a mother, a wife, a woman who'd built a life entirely on her own terms. Catherine settled against Leora's chest, her tiny fist wrapped around Leora's finger, and fell asleep with the exhausted peace of the newly born. "What do we do now?" Rhett asked softly. "Now we raise her. Teach her to be strong and kind and brave. Teach her that she always has choices, that her life is her own to build however she wants. Teach her that running toward the unknown sometimes leads you exactly where you need to be." Yes, exactly that. The years that followed were full and rich. Catherine grew into a determined, curious child who inherited her mother's strength and her father's quiet intensity. 2 years later, a son joined them, Thomas Rhett Calder, named for both his grandfathers in an act of generous forgiveness. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family. The land prospered under Rhett's careful management and Liora's innovative ideas. The community embraced them fully, and Rhett even agreed to serve on the town council, using his reputation for fairness and integrity to help shape policy. Leora's teaching expanded from informal lessons in her home to a proper schoolhouse that the community built together. She became known throughout the valley as an educator who believed in the potential of every child, especially the girls who were too often told their only future was marriage and obedience. She made sure every girl who walked through her schoolhouse door knew she had choices, knew her life was her own, knew that courage and determination could overcome almost any obstacle. On Catherine's 5th birthday, Liora stood in the yard watching her daughter chase her younger brother around the garden, shrieking with laughter. Rhett came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we've come. About that night I ran into the storm with no idea where I was going. If you'd told me then that this is where I'd end up, happy, loved, building a life I actually chose, I wouldn't have believed it was possible." "Oh, I'm glad you ran. Glad you stumbled onto my land. Glad you chose to stay. I'm glad you let me. Glad you saw me as worth saving." "You saved yourself, Liora. I just provided the space for you to do it." She turned in his arms, looked up at the man who'd given her everything by asking for nothing. "We saved each other. That's what love does. It doesn't rescue you. It gives you the courage to rescue yourself." He kissed her, soft and sweet, and their children made exaggerated gagging noises that made them both laugh. This was what Liora had run toward without knowing it. Not just freedom from her father's control, but freedom to build something beautiful, to choose love and partnership and family on her own terms, to become the woman she was always meant to be. Years later, when Catherine was old enough to understand, Liora would tell her the whole story. Not the romanticized version, but the real one. About fear and courage. About choosing yourself even when it's terrifying. About how sometimes the scariest choice is actually the right one. And Catherine would listen with wide eyes and ask, "Were you scared, Mama?" And Liora would answer honestly, "Terrified. But I was more scared of staying than of leaving, and that made all the difference." Because that was the truth that had guided her life and would guide her daughters too. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act despite it. That freedom is worth fighting for. That your life belongs to you and no one else. The run into the unknown had led her home, not to a place, but to herself. To the person she was always meant to become. And it was beautiful, 2/2